all banking is going to be evil Babylonian, but what we're saying is that there is a system that's in effect. And it's a system that will not fall until God is done judging everybody. In fact, if you remember the image of Daniel, he's speaking during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar's image is that figure of a man with a golden head. And he says to Nebuchadnezzar, "Thou, O king, are the head of gold." So he's telling Nebuchadnezzar what part he plays in history. Now, that head does not fall until the feet are struck. That 10-toed or 10-horned kingdom that we spoke about in Revelation as well as Daniel. But it's when that stone kingdom, the kingdom cut without hands, speaking of the kingdom of Jesus, when that kingdom comes is when the image falls. And the Bible says that it is crushed. And it's like the chaff tossed into the wind. But when it's all over, as we read these judgments in the book of Revelation, it's pretty awesome to read those things. First it's the seals. Then we've actually got the trumpets and then the vials. Well, after 21 separate judgments, suddenly God says he remembers Babylon. And Babylon possesses everything that man desires. So we realize that this isn't speaking of a religion per se, as many would say, that it's the Catholic Church, it's the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. They'd make it everything except what it is. It's a system that is carried through for the ages. When merchants see it from afar off, they're all going to cry. And the reason they're going to cry is because all their money's on the line. And that's one of the things that we want to deal with. We want to talk about how even the church itself gets wrapped up in these crazy schemes of finances. The church gets all wrapped up in this seeking for finances and money, and they completely lose track of what the real side is, which is God. Completely losing sight of how it is that God's system even provides for finances. And the church itself begins to think it has to invest in churchmen coming out on television talking about how many real estate holdings they possess and how much in assets they possess. And the bottom line is, if God don't bring the manna tomorrow, you need to shut down. And that's just the way it works. It's God's system. A lot of people like to make the analogy, church is just a business. You'd be surprised how many books that, they advertise and they send to me in these mail order catalogs about how to manage the church like you do a Wall Street company. That's bull crap. You don't manage a church like a Wall Street company. You don't use Madison Avenue techniques to bring people in. Holy Ghost don't need Wall Street and he doesn't need Madison Avenue. But that's the kind of stuff that they bring into the church. Completely lose sight of God's system of finances. What Babylon really takes, what it really is, and thus the church itself. In fact, if you remember the imagery of this whore sitting on the beast, the Bible says she's drunk on the blood of the saints. That the saints have partaken of her. And all I'm saying is that as a church, we need to understand that we cannot be put in a position where as a church, any church, place itself under the system of Babylon to the extent that they become controlled by the very finances and get controlled by the very budget. I've always known, you ever notice preaching how it changes when suddenly there's a budget? Huh? You ever watch these preachers on television when they first come on, you're thinking, wow, what a great preacher. All of a sudden when they got to pay the bill, suddenly the preaching changes? Suddenly they just resort to begging on television? All that stuff about, don't let us go off the air. Send your tax deductible gifts. Then they start giving away trinkets and books and junk, trying to coerce a gift out of you. All of a sudden the message changes. Suddenly the pressure of a budget does something to a man. That's the control of Babylon. That's why Jesus says you can't serve two masters. You can't serve the system. You can't serve money. You can't serve the world of finances and try to serve God simultaneously. He says it doesn't work. You'll either love one and hate the other. That's what he's saying. Because you're not going to like God. You know how God does things, don't you? God does things the way we don't like it. He says, pick up as much manna as you can eat today. And tomorrow, I'll bring it again. Now, the world says, get some and then save some. Get some and invest some. Get some and store it away somewhere so you can get enough in case God don't come through tomorrow. Well, the first thing that happens is you're out of faith. And next thing you know, you're chomping on some crow that's causing worms to come out in your mouth. If you remember the story right. Remember that? He brought them doves. But the rule was, just eat enough for today. That's the way God sustains his people. Now, I don't like that. I like security. I'm a human being. I like to know what's happening, what's coming, what to wait for. I like to know I got some in my bag. But God don't play that way. God's going to bring you the manna how often? daily. And if you don't get manna today, maybe God's trying to tell you something. You take the manna, you take the tithes of God and decide you're going to invest them. You don't need faith. You just need a good rate of return. You ain't going to be praying. I guess you would be if you had it in Enron stock. If you got your money wrapped up in something that's going to, fold. Those stocks were good at one point. You just had to understand the difference between greed and, I guess, being frugal, because there's folk who yanked their money just in time, made a fortune. I'm just saying that the church cannot get involved in that stuff. The way God operates, the way God's system of finances work, is He's going to give you manna today for what you need today. And some people don't believe that. Some people just don't want to deal with God. That's the way God does it. That's the way the church should operate. Manna every day. It's new every day. He's going to bring you provision every day. People don't want to hear that. See, you can't run a business that way, Brother Daniel. Well, I don't give a darn. We ain't running a business. We're running a church. We're running an institution that the only commodity God's looking for is faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. Now somebody says, what about stewardship? What's your stewardship? To eat all the manna you got today. If God gave you manna for today, eat it all. That's your stewardship. Go find somebody who didn't get none and give it to them. Spend it all. See, people don't like that. Because it's not faith, they say. They think, or it's not secure. They don't like faith. Anyway, we're going to get into Babylon. We started talking about Milner's kindergarten. Remember Milner? Rhodes Scholarship? Hope I don't have to review a lot, but these are men who decided. These are those that historically are referred to as Anglophiles. They're the white guys, British. These people felt that the British, as they colonized the world, that they were going to spread this system of rule over the earth that was God ordained, that was established by God, and that with this rule that was established, they were going to actually govern the world for God. So we left off talking about how Rhodes, Milner, they were inspired by Ruskin. You all remember Ruskin. He's that pervert. You guys didn't get that copy of that sheet, but in my margin it says he should have been a priest. You all remember John Right-Hand Ruskin? Yeah, some of you don't remember. We're going to leave that one alone. Again, showing you and impressing you with my tremendous disciplines. John Ruskin. He was a pervert, man. Brilliant man. Took a political tract and changed the way men thought. But we're going to read a little bit about this system that has been established. And we began to talk a little bit about how the Federal Reserve came into power. We're kind of jumping from area to area, but we want to get the big picture. Again, the whole idea or the rationale behind the things I'm throwing out there is eventually you'll be able to put it together. If I throw out a sink, a stove, a fridge, a table, somebody's going to yell, that's the kitchen, right? If we throw out a sink, a tub, and a toilet, you're going to say, that's the bathroom. We're going to get the big picture. All right, we're going to start throwing out the couch, the lamps, and the throw rug, the TV. You'll say, oh, that must be the TV room or the living room. But you're going to get to see the whole house. And we're going to do that. Let's see. All right. All right, we were talking about the Royal Institute of International Affairs. That is the counterpart to New York's Council on Foreign Relations, which is an organization that basically was the same thing. At the end of the war in 1914, it became clear that the organization of this system, the Round Table Group, this is Milner's, remember South African Milner? De Beers, the diamond trade, had greatly been extended. Once again, the task was entrusted to Lionel Curtis, who established in England and each dominion a front organization to existing round table groups. This front organization was called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. This was the British counterpart. Had its nucleus in each area existing around the submerged round table groups. Again, remember the round table groups were those individuals who privately came together to discuss, for the lack of better terms, how to run the world. how to conquer it. Now, do you think these people don't think like this? Do you really think that? In New York, it was known as the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, we talked about this in Tragedy and Hope. Remember Tragedy and Hope? These men came together and said, oh, we're just a bunch of rich men, happen to all be bankers and lawyers, and we all get together just to discuss foreign affairs and national policy and trends. And that's all we do. Isn't it coincidental that everything they discuss becomes law and policy? But that's all they do. And again, what should drive you nuts is why you've never heard of this group. Why doesn't anybody ever tell you about these folk? You know, if somebody wants to rule the world, you know, everybody says, look at Osama bin Laden. He wants to take over Afghanistan. We got to get him out. Gaddafi over there says, 33rd parallel, that's mine. We got to get him out, right? Yasser Arafat says, I want Palestine and I want those areas of Jerusalem back for my people. And everybody says, oh no, he's got to go, right? These people are trying to take over the world and nobody does anything. Huh? All right. In New York, it was known as the Council on Foreign Relations. It was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with a very small American Roundtable Group. The American organizers were dominated by a large number of the Morgan experts who had gone to the Paris Peace Conference and there became close friends with similar groups of English experts that had been recruited by the Milner Group. In fact, the original plans for the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations were drawn up in Paris. Joseph Kraft of the CFR, however, tells us in Harper's of 1958, July, the chief agent informing the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations was Colonel House, supported by such proteges as Walter Lippmann, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Christian Herter. It was House who acted as host for the Roundtable Group, both English and American. The key meeting in May 19, 1919, in the Majestic Hotel in Paris, which committed the conspiracy to the creation of the CFR. Now, if you remember Colonel House was Woodrow Wilson's shadow. He was actually the brains behind the Woodrow Wilson administration. And recently on Biography Channel and on PBS, they've been showing all these specials and telling you how great Woodrow Wilson is. Huh? And Woodrow Wilson's administration produced absolutely nothing original. In fact, if you want to know what Woodrow Wilson's platform or what Woodrow Wilson's accomplishments were while he was in office, all you've got to do is read Colonel House's political tract, Philip Drew Administrator. And we'll probably be reading some of that. In fact, FDR, everybody talks about how great FDR was. All FDR did was finish what Woodrow Wilson couldn't, inspired by the same novel. Although Quigley stresses the importance of the Morgan men at the creation and organization known as the Council on Foreign Relations, this organization's own materials and Colonel House's own memoirs reveal his function as the midwife at the birth of CFR. The CFR's 25th annual report tells us that the CFR was founded in Paris. It says, the Institute of the International Affairs, founded in Paris in 1919, was comprised at the outset of two branches, one in the United Kingdom, one in the U.S. Later, the plan was changed to create an ostensible autonomy because it seemed unwise to set up a single institute with branches. So it had to be made to appear that the CFR in America and the RIIA in Britain were independent bodies, lest the American public become aware of the CFR. So it's a secret. It was meant to. The Christian Science Monitor indicates the fantastic power of the CFR that the CFR has during the last 6 administrations. Because of the Council's single-mindedness and dedication of studying and deliberating American foreign policy, there is a constant flow of its members from private to public service. Almost half of the Council members have been invited to assume official government positions or to act as consultants at one time or another. With the outbreak of war in Europe, it was clear that the United States would be confronted. After the war, with the new and exceptional problems, accordingly, a committee on post-war problems was set up before the end of 1939, 2 years before the U.S. entered the war. The suggestion of the CFR and the committee consisted of high officials in the Department of State. All but one were CFR members. It was assisted by research staff, provided and financed by and directed by the CFR. In February 1941, it was organized into a division of special research and went off the CFR payroll onto the State Department. After Pearl Harbor, the research facilities were rapidly expanded, and the Department Committee on Post-War Problems was organized into an advisory committee of post-war foreign policies completely staffed by the CFR. This is the group which designed the United Nations, the first major step and successful step on the road to a world superstate. At least 47 CFR members were among the American delegates to the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. Members of the CFR group included Harold Stason, and it goes on and names them, Dulles, Rockefeller, John Carter, Vincent, Dean Akinson. Today, the CFR remains active, working toward its final goal of government over all the world. A government which the insiders tell us that they and their allies will control. The goal of the CFR is simply to abolish the United States with its constitutional guarantees of liberty, and they don't even try to hide it. Now, how many of you like something like that? Now, have you noticed that a lot of people just hate America? Do you know why people hate America? Why people don't like the idea? This is why I tell you, the one thing I like about September 11th is that we get to hate somebody again. I didn't like the idea that everybody's running around trying to tell us we're all the same. I don't like the idea that people run around saying that America's at fault for everything that happens, and we're not at fault for anything that happens in the world. By the way, why is America blessed? Huh? America's blessed because of who it is in God. We're not blessed specifically because America was founded by white people. America's blessed because of where its people come from and who they are. There's a destiny. People don't like to hear that. People want to tell us how we're all the same. They're trying to get rid of what they call national sovereignty. We don't want to be the U.S. So the Council on Foreign Relations has a goal of getting rid of the United States and its constitutional guarantees of liberty. A study number 7 published by the CFR on November 25, 1959 openly advocates building a new international order which must be responsive to world aspirations for peace and for social and economic change. An international order, a code for world government, including states labeling themselves as socialists. So they want to rule the world. Administrations, both Democrat and Republican, come and go, but the CFR lingers on. That is why the more things seem to change, the more they remain the same. The fix is at the top. This is where the insiders are. They're bent on control of the world. They run the show. As Professor Quigley admits, there does exist and has existed for a generation an international network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. The insiders have no aversion to working with the communists, whose ostensible goal is to destroy them, while the insiders are serving champagne and caviar to their guests in the summer mansion at Newport, or entertaining other members of the social elite abroad in their yachts. Their agents are out enslaving and murdering people, and you're the next on their list. Clearly, the Chicago Tribune's editorial December 9, 1950 on the CFR still applies. The members on the Council on Foreign Relations are persons much more than the average influence in their community. They have used their prestige and their wealth, their social position, their education to take the lead of their country and to take it toward bankruptcy and military debacle. They should look at their hands. There's blood on them. The dried blood of the last war, the flesh blood of the present one. Speaking of the Korean War at the time. Goes without saying, CFR's hands are bloodier. Now with the gore of 50,000 Americans in Vietnam, shamefully, the Council has succeeded in promoting as often as they do American policy. Should not be surprising to learn that there is on an international level an organization equivalent to the CFR. A group calls itself the Bilderbergers. And we'll talk about them as we read Jim Marrs. Let's go ahead and put old Gary Allen down for now. Hopefully you get a picture of who these fellows are and what they do. They're bent on taking over the world. Now tell me that doesn't sound like Babylon or Revelation. Huh? All right. We already read about Harry Truman. Actually, we didn't. Harry Truman dropped the bomb. All right, here we go. Shadows of Power. Kind of get a feel for why these books have these names this way. All right. This part will get you mad. All right. The average American probably does not know or even think very much about the Federal Reserve System, but a few things should be noted about it. Although it's called federal, it's private. Did y'all figure that one out yet? It's privately owned money. It has never received a meaningful audit from any independent source. It makes its own policies and is not subject to the President or the Congress. It's a private bank. As to the Federal Reserve Board itself, its members are appointed by the President or approved by the Senate, but once in office they serve 14-year terms. That way the President, no administration ever has power over them. Paul Warburg was appointed, the original board. Benjamin Strong of the Morgan Interest, who had been at Jekyll Island with him, headed the New York Fed, the system's nucleus. They have access to our money. How did the Federal Reserve benefit the financiers who secretly designed it? First, in its capacity as an overseer and supplier of reserves, it gave their banks access to public funds in the U.S. Treasury, enhancing their capacity to lend and collect interest. So what the Fed, or in essence the creation of the Fed, did was it gave private bankers the access to all our tax money. Now, how many of you thought the IRS collects money for the government? Huh? You ever notice why the IRS can be as rogue as it is? You ever notice there isn't constitutional protection against the IRS? The IRS comes and says you owe money and you're guilty before you're proven innocent. It's not like the law. See, constitutional law says you're innocent till proven guilty. IRS says you owe and you got to prove you don't. By the way, how do you prove you don't owe? Huh? You can't prove you don't owe. Furthermore, by staffing the Federal Reserve's management with themselves or their associates, the international bankers gained effective control over the nation's money supply and the interest rates. Finally, the Fed was empowered to buy and sell government securities and to loan member banks so that they might themselves purchase these securities, thus greatly multiplying their potential for government indebtedness to the banking community. However, if Washington was to incur debts, it had to have some means of paying it off. The solution was income tax. So if the government is going to borrow money, the banker said, you guys got to have a way to have it paid back. So they said, okay, we're going to have income tax. Now, where'd the idea of income tax come from? Came from Philip Drew, administrator, Colonel House, that guy who wrote the novel, the Texas guy. He's famous for helping Texans get into office. Suddenly, he's in charge of Woodrow Wilson's administration. From behind the shadows, doing all the work. Feeding Wilson all the policy. And again, he was called the midwife of the CFRs. Huh? Because income tax had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1895, it had to be instituted by constitutional amendment. The man who brought forward the amendment in Congress was the same senator that proposed the plan for the Federal Reserve, Nelson Aldrich. Remember him? He's the guy that took that $300,000 trip to Europe, and he was supposed to explore and study banking with the Europeans, and he came back without any plan. And then he goes off to Jekyll Island with the bankers and lets Paul Warburg head up this group, and they put together and they hash out a banking system, and then Aldrich comes back and proposes it as a banking system that loses in its first appeal to become law, but then comes right back as a Democratic amendment, and it passes right before Christmas. So who introduced, or who's the one that brought the income tax back and made it a constitutional amendment? Nelson Aldrich. You think his kids like this legacy? It becomes necessary to create a flow of income for the government Thus, you have to have a graduated income tax. Hey, does a bank lend you money if you don't have a job? You ever hear those commercials? Come and buy a car from me. All you need is a check stub. What does a check stub prove? That you got income. Now, how is a banker going to lend a country money if a country doesn't have income? So Mr. Aldrich prepares and produces a constitutional amendment because income tax is unconstitutional. So he creates an amendment that gets passed and amends the Constitution to say that they get to collect. Now, who gets to collect the money? Yeah, the bankers. Isn't that something? You talk about closing a deal with the devil. Now, you know what's worse? People don't know this. And you try to talk to people about this, they'll think you're a nut. So Aldrich to the rescue. Why did the American people consent to the income tax? Initially, it was nominal, a 1% of income under $20,000. But do you know why it was called a graduated income tax? Everybody said, we can deal with that. 1% under $20,000, a figure few made those days. Naturally, there were assurances that they would never increase. Yep, and the check's in the mail. By the way, once you put it into the books, it's over. Remember when the first original draft of the Federal Reserve bill went in? Their whole idea was just pass it. We'll change it as we go along. You pass the income tax amendment, and they weren't worried about it because they knew they'd fix it as it goes along. Started out at 1% for incomes of $20,000. That's reasonable. Let's see. Another sales pitch used to sell the tax was that being graduated, it would soak the rich. But Senator Aldrich, back into the amendment, implied that the rich desired it. America's billionaire elite, of course, are notorious for sidestepping the IRS. And we'll learn about this later, but do you know the richest people in the world, what they did, or at least the richest millionaires and billionaires in the U.S. did right before this law passed? They created nonprofit foundations. Now, let's not be fools. The rich pay the majority of the taxes in this country because they make more money. All right? The greatest part of the tax base comes from rich people. All right? Because they make more. Yeah, but there is more poor people. Percentage-wise, more of us bear a burden of heavy taxes, but they pay more in money. Remember that guy when George W. was proposing that tax rebate we got? And people were upset saying, rich people can buy a Lexus, but poor people can't even buy the muffler to that car. Of course not. How much money do they put into the system? Huh? If you're making $20,000 a year, how much money are you really putting in? Now, what if you're making $100,000? How much are you putting in? Well, some of you that make some pretty decent money know how much money comes out of your check. I still remember the first time I saw a check and asked, who's FICA? Huh? See, I understood what the federal tax and the state, but this FICA fella and the work comp fella and all that other stuff. Senator Aldrich, backing of the amendment, implied the rich desired it. America's billionaire elite, of course, are notorious for sidestepping the IRS. The Pecora hearings of 1933, for example, revealed that J.P. Morgan had not paid any income tax in 1931 and 32. When Nelson Rockefeller was being confirmed as vice president under Gerald Ford, the fact arose that he hadn't paid any income tax since 1970. But y'all know why, right? It's not because he's a crook. It's because he was non-profit. He didn't own nothing. One of the leading devices which the wealthy dodge one of the leading devices by which the wealthy dodge taxes is the channeling of their fortunes into tax-free foundations. The major foundations, though commonly regarded as charitable institutions, often use their grant-making powers to advance the interests of their founders. The Rockefeller Foundation, for example, has poured millions into the Council of Foreign Relations, which in turn serves as the establishment's main bridge of influence in the U.S. government. By the time the income tax became law in 1913, the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations were already operating. So they don't have to pay tax. Income tax didn't soak the rich, it soaked the middle class. Because it was graduated, it tended to prevent anybody from rising to affluence. So you think you're going to get rich? Thus it acted to consolidate the wealth of the entrenched interests and protect them from any new competition. In other words, it keeps people from getting rich. The year 1913 was an ominous one. there existed the means to loan the government colossal sums of money through the Federal Reserve and the means to exact the payment in the form of income tax. All that was needed now was a good reason for Washington to borrow. In 1914, World War I erupted. Now, remember we were talking about the two theories? Either things happen by accident or they're planned. Now listen, look, let's just pretend we're stupid. All right? Let's just pretend we're stupid. And the Federal Reserve plan gets issued. A graduated income tax is put into place. Now we have a system by which the international bankers can loan America huge sums of money. But the problem with America is that we're self-sufficient. The farmers are making tons of money because they grow crops and everybody has enough food. The cost of food in America is low because we got so much rich farmland. We got a lot of labor base. We've got tons. We don't need anybody, and we don't care about anybody. We're an isolationist nation. We don't want to mess with nobody. We don't want nobody to mess with us. Just leave us alone. We're Americans. So here come the bankers saying, y'all need some money? Get lost. All right? Y'all need railroads? No, we already got them. Ships? Nope, we got them too. Cars? Nope, we got them. Y'all need farm subsidies? Nope, we got them. Y'all need school loans? Nope, we got schools. What do we need? Huh? Reparations? No. Well, I mean, think of it. What do we need? We don't need nothing. Man, back then, oil was coming out of Texas like, like water. So suddenly, you got this great system set up. And again, let's pretend we're stupid. Got this great system in place, but America don't need nothing. I mean, our country basically has the attitude that we can do anything by ourselves. So 1914, war breaks out on the European continent. America eventually participates. As a result, her national debt soared from $1 billion to $25 billion. Many historians would have us believe that this trio of events, income tax, Federal Reserve, and the war, was a coincidence. But too often history has been written by the authors who financed the foundations. 1913, Woodrow Wilson became president. His book, The New Freedom, was published that same year. In it, he wrote, "Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce, manufacture, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." Wilson knew this force intimately. His predecessor, Republican William Howard Taft, had been against a central bank, saying he would veto the bill proposing one. For this reason, the international bankers sought to replace Taft with a submissive candidate, Woodrow Wilson, and he was rocketed from the president of Princeton University to governor of New Jersey in 1911 to the Democratic presidential nominee in 1912. Among his weighty financial backers was Cleveland Dodge of Rockefeller's National City Bank, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn and Lieb, and Bernard Baruch. According to one eyewitness, Baruch brought Wilson to the Democratic Party headquarters in 1912, leading him like one would lead a poodle on a string. And they didn't show that on that biography. Wilson received an indoctrination course from one of the leaders that convened there, during which he agreed in principle to the following, if elected: support the Federal Reserve Project, support income tax, lend an ear of advice should war break out in Europe, and lend an ear of advice of who should occupy the cabinet. Now, we've already talked about how Taft was an incumbent president. The U.S. had been prosperous and at peace, and there was no way possibly that anybody was going to whoop him. Till the feds threw money behind Teddy Roosevelt, who came in running on a third party. And then Woodrow Wilson won. Under House's watchful eye, Wilson paid off as arranged. House was reported to have handpicked his cabinet. At Wilson's first cabinet meeting, Franklin Lane introduced himself saying, "My name is Mr. Lane. My name is Lane, Mr. President. I believe I'm the Secretary of the Interior." Must be nice, huh? Another objective specified in Philip Drew was a League of Nations. This, of course, was precisely the name given to the world body created at Woodrow Wilson's suggestion during the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Just as the 1907 panic was employed to justify central bank, so was World War I used to justify world government. It is certainly true that a number of America's money barons, including Wilson campaign backers, profited from the war. The president appointed, you'll love this part, you'll get really pissed at this too. He appointed Bernard Baruch, head of the War Industries Board. Now, you'll get upset because let's get a feel for what it is that happens. Let's talk about a little bit about our government. Not bad, but let's talk about it. The Constitution says that should the government begin to encroach on the rights of its citizens, the citizens have a right to suspend government and start over. Now, the only way that you can actually stop the people from suspending government is to make it for the citizens such a hard choice that they would rather not do it. Now, let's say, for example, today we just got fed up with the government charging too much taxes. We're not seeing equality like we think we should. And let's just assume that we don't like the idea that, all this money used in financing is buying unequal representation with the politicians. And everybody jumped up and says, we want to suspend government and start over. Because our Constitution allows us that. And to start over on the Constitution gives us a clean slate and gives us, again, the true freedom and liberty that we once had at one time. Now, somebody stands up and says, that's a good idea, except that I work for Northrop, you might work for Hughes, somebody works for Marietta, somebody might work for Boeing, and they all have government contracts. If you suspend government, their money stops. We're not going to get paid. Right? And then the medical professionals go say, yeah, but we're going to lose our money too, because all the Medi-Cal, all the Medicaid, all this insurance, well, we ain't going to get paid. And then the teachers say, well, where are we going to get our state and federal money from now? Huh? So to suspend government, what are you doing? Nobody's going to get paid. Well, wait a minute. Wasn't America based on individuals creating businesses? Weren't they private industries? How'd they get their hands on everything? Now see, people have the idea that things happen by accident. Now again, one of the only institutions that is truly still free in this country, in fact, it's one of the last bastions of freedom, is the church. That is the only place the government can control. So he appoints Bernard Baruch, head of the War Industries Board, a position never authorized by Congress. As such, Bernard Baruch became the economic czar of the United States, having dictatorial power over the nation's businesses. He, like the Rockefellers, is said to have reaped some $200 million from the war. Top Wilson Becker, Cleveland Dodge shipped munitions to the Allies, and J.P. Morgan supplied them with hundreds of millions of loans, which, of course, the U.S. entry into the world helped protect. But profit was not only the evident motive behind our participation in the conflict. Examined old records of the powerful Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a longtime promoter of globalism. They discovered that several years before the outbreak of World War I, Carnegie trustees had hoped to involve the U.S. in a general war to set the stage for world government. Now, how can you be peace-seeking and at the same time trying to involve us in war so that you can set a platform for peace? By the way, we're talking about Bernard Baruch and his position. I'm going to stay in this book for a little bit more. He's the War Industries Board. What Bernard Baruch got to do was he got to say, your business, Charles. You're going to make the gears and machinery for our tanks. And your business, Robert. You get to make the toilet seats for our planes. And Lorraine, your company's going to get to sew the uniforms. And his job was to award government contracts to whoever he wanted. Now, if there was a machine shop that didn't agree with his politics, they wouldn't get a government contract. So what happened to them? Bye-bye. Because with government contracts, Charles would say, my machine shop's capable of doing it, but you're going to have to give me the means to produce the amount you want. So the government would make Charles's machine shop, 10 times bigger. Now, who don't want their place 10 times bigger? Huh? You just had to sleep with the whore to get it. Huh? And once you got that place 10 times bigger, that contract better keep coming, huh? And your donations better keep going to the right politician. Huh? So Bernard Baruch becomes in charge of the War Industries Board. Now he has power literally to say, your company lives, yours dies. You're not in compliance, you're gone. And thus these government contracts are awarded. It's wartime. Congress didn't even approve this position. The president did. And all of a sudden this man's got power to say, I want this hospital huge because we're going to have probably a lot of people doing rehab when they come back from the war. Can you imagine having such power? Man, if I knew a dude had power, I'd be greasing his palms. Huh? How about mine? Prior to 1917, America stayed clear of the European wars. George Washington, in his farewell address, had warned the nation against entangling in foreign alliances. His counsel was heeded only too happily by the American people, because Americans just didn't care about anybody else. And that's good. The counsel was heeded only too happily by the American people, millions of whom had come to this country to escape oppression overseas, and naturally nobody wanted to fight a war of dubious origins. It was therefore necessary to devise an incident that would supply the provocation. This occurred when a German submarine sank the British ocean liner, the Lusitania, on its way from New York to England. 128 Americans on board perished. After this tragedy, it says, and at this tragedy, more than any other event, it was used to arouse anti-German sentiment in the United States. Certain facts, however, were denied to the public. Thanks to the work of the British author Colin Simpson in his book, The Lusitania, much of the truth is now known today. This is something they never tell you. Everybody knows about the sinking of Lusitania, right? That was the incident, kind of like the World Trade Center, that was the incident to involve American war. America didn't want anything to do with the Germans. But what nobody told you was, everybody made you think it was a cruise liner. Hey, we all been to Queen Mary, right? What is the Queen Mary? It's a luxury liner, right? Anybody notice the guns on the deck? Huh? Because it was recommissioned during the war. Became a troop transport. Y'all know that, right? When was the last time you got on a cruise ship and saw the guns on the deck? Cannons all over the ship. The Lusitania was transporting 6 million rounds of ammunition, plus other war munitions, to Britain, which is why the Germans sank it. Internal explosions caused the ship to go down in 18 minutes. The information was suppressed at the subsequent hearings that investigated the sinking. Woodrow Wilson ordered the ship's original manifest, which listed the munitions, to be hidden in the Treasury archives. I like that. Even more pertinent is evidence that the ship was deliberately sent to disaster. Before the incident, Winston Churchill, then the head of British Admiralty, had ordered a report done to predict the political impact of a passenger ship sinking carrying Americans. The following conversation took place between Colonel House and Sir Edwin Grey, the British Foreign Minister. Grey: what will Americans do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? House: I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself it would be sufficient to carry us into war. The British had cracked Germany's naval code and knew the approximate whereabouts of all U-boats in the vicinity of the British Isles. According to Commander Joseph Kenworthy, then in the British Naval Intelligence, said, the Lusitania was deliberately sent at a considerably reduced speed into an area where the U-boats were. And then her escorts were withdrawn. Now, if you had relatives on the Lusitania, wouldn't you be mad? It should be noted that the Germans had taken out large ads in New York papers in an effort to dissuade Americans from boarding the ship. What considerate guys, huh? Their Navy was attempting to stop war supplies from reaching England, just as the British Navy was doing to them. Who was the real aggressor in the war is a matter of debate. Had America not participated, the belligerents of Europe would have probably reached a settlement, as those nations had been doing for centuries. Woodrow Wilson was reelected in 1916 on the slogan, he kept us out of war, but those words were short-lived. Colonel House in England had already negotiated a secret agreement committing us to join the conflict. We'll stop there. right, on the back portion there's a summary. It says the ideas that we hold most dear are at stake. It is necessary for these men to realize their ideals, to do away with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The notion of representation or representative government is an anathema to these men. The rights we hold are what keeps them from taking over. They will chip away until they get what they want. A world with no borders, no national sovereignty, and no USA. That's what they're looking for. We'll leave that one there. Come back to rule by secrecy. Today there are more than 40,000 tax-exempt foundations operating within the United States alone, most professing the most laudable of intentions. Yet many can be seen as furthering the secret society's agendas of globalization and centralized government. Norman Dodd, y'all probably remember that name. Norman Dodd, Director of Research for the House Select Committee to investigate foundations and comparable organizations, in 1952 reported that the president of the Ford Foundation had told him bluntly that operating under directive from the White House, his foundations were to use grant-making powers so to alter our life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Y'all like that? Didn't Ronald Reagan say they were the evil empire? At a superficial glance at some of the past and current organizations, foundations, they're linked to the Skull and Bones. Again, it's a secret society out of Yale, the CFR, Trilateral Commission, the Illuminati, other secret societies by which several writers reveal some surprises. To name just a few, these include the Agency of International Development, American Civil Liberties Union, American Council of Race Relations, the American Press Institute, the Anti-Defamation League, the Arab Bureau, Aspen Institute, Association of Humanistic Psychology, the Battelle Memorial Institute, Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, Centers for Constitutional Rights, Centers for Cuban Studies, Centers for Democratic Institutions, Christian Socialist League, Communist League, Environmental Funds, Fabian Society, Ford Foundation, Foundation on National Progress, German Marshall Fund, Hudson Institute, Institute for Pacific Relations, Institute on Drugs, Crime and Justice, International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Mellon Institute, Metaphysical Society, Milner Group, Mont Pelerin Society, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, National Councils of Churches, New World Foundation, Rand Institute, Stanford Research Institute, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Union of Concerned Scientists, International Red Cross, and the YMCA. Now, these are all organizations that have been linked to the Skull and Bones, the CFR, and the Trilateral Commission. That must be fun, being a white guy, throwing thousands of dollars to black organizations so that they can turn around and yell, "Whitey!" Huh? That must be fun. Huh? Be a bunch of rich white dudes, and you throw a bunch of money at the ACLU so that they can stand up and say, "You heterosexuals are sick." Huh? That must be fun, huh? The Aspen Institute, for example, is a global concern with considerable diplomatic influence, with nearly 60 million in assets, that regularly hosts presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, statesmen, advisors, educators, journalists, artists, activists, and a roster of corporate representatives to rival the Fortune 500 list. Noted Paul Anderson, writing in the Aspen Times Weekly. Yet despite its national, indeed international prominence, the Institute remains an enigma to the majority of local residents and visitors. Let's read about the IPS. The Institute was founded in the 1940s as the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Study. The appellation regarding humanism was dropped off in the 1970s. Founders included Walter Paepke, Chicago industrialist Maynard Hutchins, president of the Rockefeller-dominated University of Chicago, Mortimer Adler, a philosopher and CFR, and Bones member Henry Luce, the powerful head of the Time Life publications. All of these men were closely connected to the University of Chicago-affiliated Encyclopedia Britannica, Inc. Isn't that funny? It's called the Encyclopedia Britannica, but you all know that that's published out of the University of Chicago, right? Or did y'all think it was British? Huh? And y'all know who pays for the University of Chicago, right? This is driving you crazy. Huh? Does it bother you that the notion or that the illusion of freedom has been preached when, in essence, what's been happening is there's been a handful of men that have not only manipulated the world, but they've manipulated your life without you knowing it? Huh? Watch the news. Think you're getting educated because you read Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report? Huh? Think you're getting the straight facts and you're just getting lied to? These people are framing the picture they want you to see? Huh? Send your kid to school and they lie to them. Send your kid to a think tank and they get lied to. Buy your kid a set of encyclopedias and they frame the picture they want him to see. Huh? You join a foundation like the YMCA and think it's Christian? Huh? Sponsored by the National Council of Churches? Huh? Despite a series of fierce disagreements with the town of Aspen over expansion and land use, the Institute continues to utilize the restful Rocky Mountain atmosphere to soothe the attendees at many of its influential seminars and conferences. The Institute for Policy Studies, an umbrella organization encompassing hundreds of diverse groups representing both the left and the right of the political spectrum. Now, is that possible? Huh? To have an umbrella group that supports both parties? By the way, did y'all vote today? Did y'all go vote? Did y'all go pick who you want to screw you? Because that's about all it is. You pick the one that'll probably give it to you easier. Or at least the way you like it. Glad my wife ain't in here. She gets on my case about stuff like that. She said, you can't talk like that. I learned it from God. He's got two nations. They don't know how to act, and he brings up a hole and a hole about getting taken every way they can. I'm just telling you, I ain't going to get taken both ways like she did. The IPS has shaped and reshaped United States policies, foreign and domestic, since it was founded by James P. Warburg and the Rothschild entities in the United States, bolstered by Bertrand Russell and the British socialists through its networks in America. Isn't that wild? And we think we're Americans, huh? You ever see that in the world, like Taiwan? You notice how the Taiwanese and the Chinese, they're fighting? Because the Chinese are saying, Taiwan's ours. And the Taiwanese are saying, we left the mainland because we don't want to be yours. South Korea, North Korea, they separate and they're fighting. Right? I don't have to tell you about North and South Vietnam. What happens when a nation loses possession of one of its colonies? They're fighting all the time, right? How come the British just left us alone? After whooping all over Africa, just whooping all over, the world, taking over everything, how come, 13 colonies, whooping a couple decisive battles, and they just decide to leave us alone? It's not like they couldn't get no folk down here, man. They already had Canada. Huh? Ain't that how the Arabs did it? You come in through Canada. How come the British left us alone? Huh? We just got a new flag, but they still run us. Huh? You hear Tony Blair the other day? Iran is next, or Iraq is next. Those good-for-nothing French. Those good-for-nothing French said, hey, if you start messing with Iraq, we're going to have to back up. Huh? What the hell is wrong with them guys? Tony Blair jumps up and says, we got to go get Iraq. I'll tell you. Starting to get an idea why the Eiffel Tower is their symbol. don't know what you're thinking of. I got a crazy congregation here. The objectives of the IPS came from an agenda laid down by the British Round Table. One of the most notable being to create the New Left as a grassroots movement in the U.S. The IPS was to engender strife and unrest and spread chaos like a wildfire out of control, proliferate the ideals of left-wing nihilistic socialism, support unrestricted use of drugs of all types, and to be the big stick with which to beat the United States political establishment. This is the IPS, Institute for Policy Studies, laid down by the round tables. The British did this. And what is the intention of the IPS? Let me ask you a question. Let's go through these. The objectives of the IPS came from the agenda laid down by the British Round Table. One most notable was to create a new left. What's a new left? What is new left? What? All right, let's find out. A grassroots movement in the U.S. They're going to engender strife and unrest and spread chaos like wildfire, proliferate ideas of left-wing nihilistic socialistic support. Now, ain't that what we got right now? Huh? Don't we got a nation that's pretty much wrapped up and headed into socialism? We got a nation of people that don't want land, they want bread. Everything handouts. That mentality where everything should be given to them. It's owed to them. Everybody thinks something's owed to them. That mentality that, bless God, they owe me. Ain't nobody owe you nothing. Left-wing nihilistic support. That's what that is. It's that whole mentality that thinks they're entitled to something. I'm American. I'm entitled to help. Why? I'm entitled to care. Who said? I heard a guy on the radio today. He said, we live in America, and we're the only country where the government doesn't take care of the people. The government was never intended to take care of the people. You're supposed to protect your rights so you can take care of yourself. Support unrestricted use of drugs of all types. All right. According to Coleman, IPS founders Richard Barnett and Marcus Raskin have controlled such diverse elements such as the Black Panthers. Y'all thought Eldridge Cleaver was the boss, huh? Now, look, I ain't black, but I would be pissed off if I found out these brothers with the black hats were funded and that their ideals were promoted and provided by white dudes. Huh? Because does anybody ever tell you this? Does anybody ever tell you who funds the NAACP? Huh? You know, they have their own awards on television. Huh? It says, for black people, by black people. Huh? I don't know about you, but doesn't that get you mad? Isn't that deceptive? Wouldn't that be fun to be white and give money to a black guy so he can jump up and call you cracker? Charles, here's $10. Call me wetback and pepper belly. And create an environment of unrest so that people come in and say, peace, let's make peace. Huh? Anybody else want to play? The British control IPS. The IPS founders, Richard Barnett and Marcus Raskin, have controlled such diverse elements as the Black Panthers, Daniel Ellsberg, the National Security Council staff member Morton Halperin, and Weatherman. Remember the Weatherman? The Venceremos and the campaign staff candidate George McGovern. Author Stephen Powell noted and stated, IPS goal was to dismantle all economic, political, social, and cultural institutions in the United States. That's including churches. Following an extensive investigation just prior to the collapse of communism, he concluded, an ordered accounting of the IPS activities reveals that much of what that institute does, for all intents and purposes, also serves the interests of the Soviet Union, The IPS has been remarkably successful in promoting a sweeping radical agenda by maintaining the facade of a liberal scholarly research center. According to the researchers, much IPS funding comes from CFR-connected organizations, including Rubin Foundation, represented by New York law firm of Lord, Day & Lord. Lord family was counted members of the Rolls of the Skull and Bones since 1898. Winston Lord, the Order of 1959, and former aide to Henry Kissinger in 1983, was chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and later President Reagan's ambassador to China. A longtime president of the Ford Foundation was the ubiquitous George Bundy, or McGeorge Bundy, CFR member, Bonesman also, national security advisor who presided over the Gulf of Tonkin incident, precipitating Vietnam War. Now, I don't know if you know about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, but that was the incident that started the Vietnam War, or at least justified involvement. And the guys that were on the ship, the officers, finally confessed. They told us we were being attacked, so we shot shells all night long. And didn't know what we were shooting at. And the next day we were told we're at war. And everything we're taught in school is that the Viet Cong sent 2 little patrol boats at this big battleship. Anybody that stupid? Huh? And they started shelling everything. That's what this guy did, George Bundy. In the mid-1980s, a movement toward rewriting the U.S. Constitution gained momentum, in part due to the work of the Center of Study for Democratic Institutions, which was established with Ford Foundation money. It floundered in the face of widespread opposition. See, one of the things that happens in America, they like test the waters. They throw stuff out and see what happens. When American people don't like it, and they do it again. Just comes back another way. It's like the devil. It's the way the devil did Jesus. He tempted Jesus. When he realized he couldn't tempt him, the Bible says the devil departed. The Bible uses a Greek term that boxers use. That means when he threw punches and the guy blocked him or defended him, you step back looking for the other opening. That's what these guys did. Just like the Aldrich plan. Comes through first time, doesn't make it. Comes through a second time, disguised. Exact same plan, passes. We're going to skip some of this. Famous students from the London School of Economics include David Rockefeller, Joseph Kennedy Jr., his younger brother, future President John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, future Senator Daniel Moynihan, Zechariah Stitchin, and newscaster Eric Sevared. Government alphabet agencies include agencies susceptible to secret society control, include not only the CIA. Now, doesn't that bother you that other people control the CIA? And I've told you, Central Intelligence Agency, it doesn't look out for our country. It looks out for our bankers, our industries. The National Security Council, Federal Bureau of Investigation, National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Reconnaissance Office, Drug Enforcement Agency, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Internal Revenue Service, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and many others. These agencies are themselves secretive, citing reasons as national security, executive privilege, or the need to protect informants or criminal case files. Now, who thought all those agencies had a sole interest of protecting the country? One prime example of tight intergovernment control by secret society members may be found in the National Security Council, which since its creation by the National Security Act 1947 has come to dominate U.S. policy-making decisions and those used with the armed forces. Most Americans have no idea exactly what comprises the powerful NSC. They might be surprised to learn that the council principals are the President, Vice President, Secretary of State, and Defense, positions predominantly held by members of the CFR or the Trilateral Commission throughout the 20th century. All right. This group has been called by many names. The New World Order, the Committee of 300, the Illuminati, Secret Brotherhood, or often simply they. More than one author suggests that these persons are themselves guided or controlled by non-human intelligences, described as prison wardens or custodians. Y'all heard the stories about how the aliens are running things, right? Or the X-Files. Now, That sounds like something pretty stupid to interject in something like this. They're serious. What you all think of UFOs and aliens? What do you really know about UFOs and aliens? Huh? Now let me ask you a question. These people that are probably the highest bred, most intelligent people, richest people in the world, that have studied and who have foresight as to how the world goes, why do they believe in UFOs, aliens, and such control, and we don't? Huh? Why, when a UFO supposedly crashed in Roswell, was Rockefeller in charge? Huh? So, when we read things like this, some authors suggest that they're controlled by non-human intelligences. Who controls the system? Huh? Principalities, powers, mights, dominions. Not necessarily extraterrestrial, maybe intraterrestrial. Huh? Till the dawn of the 20th century, this plan for a new world order was cemented in masonry, then illuminated masonry. But with the advent of the roundtable groups, which still exist today, their American brethren, the Council on Foreign Relations, the torch has been passed from century to century. By mid-1999, it appeared that the same old torch was being passed as election year 2000 began to shape. Advocating the compassionate conservatism, George W. Bush, the eldest son of former President CIA director, who belonged to all the aforementioned secret societies, was the leading Republican candidate. Clinton's vice president and CFR member Al Gore led a contentious gang of Democrats. Early on, Gore sought guidance from the leading lights of Wall Street. Now, doesn't it bother you that both these guys belong to the same organizations, but they just have two different agendas? It might not matter. I told you, going the same place, just got two ways of getting there. Once again, the American electorate was had to choose between globalists or a globalist supported Bush or globalist supported Gore. Obviously, the globalist will be the winner, regardless of the election outcome. In 1999, globalism suffered a slight setback when more than 60,000 demonstrators, representing an odd mixture of unionists, environmentalists, and strict constitutionalists, protested the loss of the United States sovereignty and jobs during a meeting of the World Trade Organization in Seattle. Now, y'all remember that, right? WTO came to meet in Seattle, and everybody came out really upset because what they're trying to do is get rid of national sovereignty. This is what NAFTA's about. You're not Mexican, you're not American, we're about money. We're about business. We're about uniting a hemisphere. So they were pissed. Predictably, the corporate-controlled news media styled the protests as unruly rioters, although other accounts claim that the trouble began only after heavily armed police began clubbing and gassing the participants. Simply, the controversial General Agreement or Tariffs and Trade, which is GATT, renamed in 1995 the World Trade Organization, was widely seen as nothing more than a vehicle to further the Bilderberger goal of removing all trade barriers, noting that free trade breaks up old nationalities and hastens the social revolution. Karl Marx in 1848 proclaimed, "I'm in favor of free trade." So what is the rationale and purpose of the World Trade Organization? Which basically was nothing more than the same organization that established the GATT treaties. It's basically a move toward removing what's called national sovereignty into a globalized market. All right, we'll close here. As the goal of a new world order moves closer to reality today, authors and researchers who are suspicious of the role of the secret societies and their financial backers in government, businesses, and foundations feel they face a disheartening maze of obstructions in trying to bring the story to the public. Major publishers won't publish the news Agencies won't accept or distribute the stories, and they often ridicule authors and writers as alarmists and conspiracy theorists. Occasionally, there is even more a threat of violence against investigators who dig too deep. The eyes of the average citizen, conditioned to consider only the issues presented in their daily media, glaze over at any discussion of secret societies or hidden history. After all, they ask, if any of this were true or real, wouldn't it be covered on 60 Minutes or the nightly news? We'll stop there. All right, we're done.